Hello and welcome to the
I watched the Russian.
my opinion, one
See you,
of Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Brussels Signal Horizon podcast. It is with great pleasure, and I've been trying to get to him for almost a year, that I can introduce you to Dr. Anas Alhajji. Dr. Anas, I think you are based in Texas, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
So Dr. Anas is, in my opinion, one of the finest and most informed voices when it comes to everything energy related, oil and gas. He runs a fantastic Substack. His X account, that will post links in the description of this video, is an absolute must follow. He also recommends, which he also started doing, there are some fantastic Arabic speaking sites out there, but you can always hit translate on X, which is also very helpful. So he's a bottomless well of information and news. Now, one topic I would love to talk about specifically today, and it's a very broad one to start with, and I'm so curious to get your take on this. What do you think, from kind of both from an analytical viewpoint, but maybe also from a gut feeling perspective? What's the future of OPEC? Where do you think the cartel is moving in the years ahead?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the kind words. OPEC and OPEC Plus are not a cartel. There are several reasons for that. Those who are interested, there are several academic papers, some of them I wrote, to explain why it is not a cartel. And the reason why this is important, because it helps us understand the oil market. If we keep saying it's a cartel and it's not a cartel, that means our understanding of the market is not correct. There are certain characteristics for cartels that do not fit OPEC and OPEC Plus. One of the problems we have in the literature is that we have several fields within the science of economics. Call it decimal science or whatever, but it's still it's a science. So we have different fields. And we have the economics that we usually teach Econ 101 to our students, which most of the people are familiar with. But we do have a separate field that is completely different, called the economics of natural resources. Natural resources have a completely different treatment from any other industrial products. And the problem that the media has and many analysts have is that they mix between the two, and they take Econ 101 and the industrial products and apply the concepts to exhaustible resources. That does not make any sense. The oil industry, among others like mining and everything else, they have a completely different principles. And one of the main differences is that most of your cost is at the beginning is a sunk cost. So if you drill an oil well and costs you $8 million and that is dry, that's it. Your $8 million are gone. Refilling the well by sand is not going to recover your money. But if you discover oil, since most of your cost basically is already being paid in advance, what matters to you over the following years is your operating cost, not your total cost. And your operating cost is so small relative to the sunk cost, that makes the oil industry completely different from others, because the oil industry can operate at loss for a very long time without any problems, because you are just extracting that oil at a very small operating cost, while the prices are way higher than your operating cost, but could be higher than the total cost. And that's different from the industrial products. So that's one of the main differences. The other issue is we have enough evidence, and for those who are interested, they can go to my website or search the web for should the oil market be managed. And the idea here is any natural resource, although I am a free market economist and I do believe in free markets, and on some issues I am literally libertarian, but when it comes to natural resources, you have to manage the market. You have no other choice. And if you look at the history of the oil industry for 150 years, the stability we have, the lower cost we have, the lower wastage that we had, all of this happened when the market was managed. And when the market was not managed, we had all kind of problems, massive losses, and a loss of resources too. So the market has to be managed. And everyone throughout the oil industry realized this fact, including the US federal government, the Texas government, the Oklahoma government, the Louisiana government, and even the Seven Sisters, Rockefeller. Everyone basically realized that the market has to be managed. So to go back now to your question, since this was just the introduction, when OPEC was established in September 1960 in Baghdad, of course, that was the date of the establishment, but before that, years before that, there are people who worked on the idea until they streamlined the idea and talked to people, and they come around and they established OPEC. And yes, the immediate reason for establishing OPEC was the oil companies' reduction of prices. But this was not really the reason, because people have been talking about OPEC before that. And the idea was very simple, and it's very important to today's events and the decision on Saturday by the group of 8 in OPEC Plus. The two guys who worked on this was the Venezuelan Development Minister, Alfonso Perez, and who became later the oil minister of Saudi Arabia, Abdullah Trekhi. Both of them, basically, if you look at them now and you look at their writings and they were talking about, they were really unusual men. They were literally philosophers. And they were thinking about multiple things at once, putting the oil within a bigger picture than just oil. So they were looking at oil as a way to finance the development of OPEC members. There were 5 members, and to finance the development of those countries. But if you look at their writings and their speeches in the 50s, they really wanted those countries to get rid of oil and dependence on oil as soon as possible. This is a very important point, especially if you look at what Saudi Arabia, UAE is doing right now. They are really trying to diversify and reduce the role of oil in their economies. That's what really OPEC basically was talking about in the 50s, that they wanted to get rid of dependence on oil as soon as possible. But they encountered the problem. They need to sell that oil for money because they need that money for development. So what is the price? That was the big question. And if you really ask the question, what is the price or what is the cost? Here you are talking about the core of philosophy in economics. That's what the biggest thinkers in economics basically been looking at for hundreds of years. So they said, okay, the only way to work this out is to get the best price in the market. And how to get the best price in the market? To equal supply to demand at all times. So if demand decreases, I need to cut supply. If demand goes up, I need to raise supply. And therefore I can always get the best price. So it's not about price fixing like cartels. It's about really getting the best price in the market, because this is a natural resource. This is not a factory. So we have 2 objectives now. The first one is to get rid of oil as soon as possible, and the second one is to get the best price in the market by matching supply to demand at all times. Later on, OPEC basically deviated from this. We have multiple failures over the years. We have major problems, more dependence on oil than ever, etc. Bad policies, bad politicians who just wanted the money and that's it without thinking about the future, etc. Since 2016, we have a complete change in views and attitude. We have the formation of OPEC Plus. Here I would like to point out, for those who are not familiar with the oil market, that we do have 3 groups. We have OPEC, which has 12 countries. And then we have OPEC Plus, which is OPEC plus 10 countries, including Russia and Kazakhstan, Oman, and others. And then we have the group of 8, which we call the V8, the letter V. And the group of 8 basically is a group out of OPEC Plus that decided to go for voluntary cuts. And they are the one who made the decision to increase production on Saturday. So we have OPEC, OPEC Plus, and the group of 8 or the V8. And we have 3 cuts. In November 2022, OPEC Plus as a whole decided to cut production by 2 million barrels a day. Later on, inventories continued to increase. Demand was weak, or demand growth was weak, so they decided to go for another cut. But many countries within OPEC Plus refused to cut. And the decision in OPEC Plus and OPEC are made by consensus, which means that any country has a veto power. So they couldn't agree. As a result, a group of 8 members got together and decided to go for voluntary cuts. And that was the first voluntary cut of 1.6 million or 1.65 million barrels a day. So I have 2 million by OPEC Plus, then I have 1.65 by the group of 8. That was not enough. So in November 2023, they decided to cut another voluntary cuts by 2.2 million barrels a day on the condition that they want to bring this back as soon as possible. But the market did not cooperate. And as a result, they continued to delay all of those cuts. So they delayed the first cut. The OPEC cut is delayed until the end of 2026. Now we expect in the next meeting that it will be delayed until the end of 2027. And then we have the first voluntary cut, which is 1.65. Now it is delayed until the end of 2026. And then we have the latest cut, which is the 2.2 million barrels a day. They started unwinding this on the 1st of April. And the first increase was 1.38 million barrels, 138,000 barrels a day. Then a month later, they decided to accelerate this increase by threefold to 411,000 barrels a day. So they did that in May, then they did it in June, and on Saturday they did it for July. This acceleration raised several questions. Why they did it? What are the motives? The media and most analysts basically got it completely wrong. They kind of misunderstood what does it mean to increase or to have this increase. The first fact that people missed was these increases are mostly on paper, because the Kazakhstan, Iraq, and sometimes Russia, they already increased this amount in the past. So that oil is already in the market. So when they met and they decided to raise production by 138, they are merely to make the overproduction legal.
So
they are just to legitimize. Correct. So just to legitimize the existing production. And when they decided to expedite, that was a surprise. But once you understand the logic and what's going on, it's a completely different story from what the media and analysts are telling us. For example, first of all, as I mentioned, that most of that oil is already in the market, so it cannot be that bearish. But people have forgotten that oil demand within OPEC Plus countries increases in the summer months between May and September because of the massive demand for cooling. A massive demand for cooling means large demand for electricity, which is generated by fuel oil. Fuel oil that is either used from within the country or imported from other countries. So they ignore that. And the amount is significant. It reaches, on a normal summer, it reaches 1.2 million barrels a day in the Middle East in August. And that's only in the Middle East. If it's a hot summer, it goes to 1.5 million barrels a day. This year in particular, we have 2 issues that analysts overlooked. The first one is we have the Hajj, the pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia, where millions of Muslims come from all around the world to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. and demand for gasoline, diesel, jet fuel goes through the roof. You are talking about millions of people coming to the same place and leaving after that. And then you have hundreds of thousands of hotel rooms that need to be air conditioned 24/7, lights, etc., that needs a lot of fuel oil. And they overlook the fact that Iran is not able to deliver the natural gas to Iraq because of problems within Iran. And then Trump administration imposed or refused to give Iraq a license to import electricity from Iran. So we have massive shortages of gas and electricity in Iraq, which means that based on our forecast right now, that fuel oil or oil that is going to be burnt in power plants in Iraq is going to hit record high this year. And Iraq is one of the countries that's been violating its quota. And now most of that oil is going to go to domestic consumption. The world is not going to see it. So analysts overlooked all of these things, but they overlooked several other things too. For example, today in our daily energy report, we are publishing a chart with comments showing that the exports, and we're talking about May, where the group increased production ceiling by 411,000 barrels a day. The United States, Brazil, Venezuela, and Ecuador, all of them in the Americas, North America and South America, their exports in May decreased by 977,000 barrels a day, almost a 1,000,000 barrel decrease in May, while the group of 8 increased production ceiling by only 411. So even if you forget about the domestic demand, it's merely, they cannot even cover the shortages that we had because of those countries in the Americas. And if you compare it year over year, the decrease in those 4 countries is more than 1,000,000 barrels a day in exports.
Just to put it in context, I think that the global consumption of oil at the moment is around 100 million barrel a day.
No, I'm glad you mentioned this because I'm going to mention another point that the analyst missed. Right now, the global oil demand is 104 million barrels a day. When the group of 8 decided to increase production starting the 1st of April, they had 2 conditions. First of all, OPEC and OPEC Plus do not focus on prices, and they don't talk about prices. You're not going to find a single minister who will talk about prices. They focus on inventories and growth in demand. So they had 2 conditions. They said if we see a major decline in inventories and we see increase in demand, we will increase production. Well, they were very optimistic, especially OPEC, very optimistic on growth and demand. We were not, and others basically were not. So when they decided to increase production on the 1st of April instead of extending it another quarter, we were surprised too because we did not see that demand. But immediately we found out that there was a point that we misunderstood. At least we are lucky we got the lesson within 1 hour or 2 after the decision, while others still have those problems until today. What was the lesson we learned? Our focus was always growth in global oil demand. We know that inventories decline. We know that for a fact, and everyone agrees. So the first condition is met. But for the second condition, growth in oil demand, we did not see it, but they saw it. We found out later it was our mistake because the group of 8 was not looking at growth in global oil demand. They were looking at growth in their own demand. That's the lesson we learned. And why this happened, despite the growth in global oil demand is weak? Because the Trump administration strengthened sanctions on Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. Some companies, especially Chinese and Indian, panicked. And they rushed to Saudi Arabia and UAE and Kuwait and told them, I need more oil. So those countries, the group of 8, saw an increase for their own demand. And that's what we did not understand at the beginning. Now we know. Then Trump imposed tariff on countries that import the Venezuelan oil. 25%. China stopped importing from Venezuela, and India stopped importing from Venezuela. As a result, the Venezuelan crude exports declined substantially by about 350,000 barrels a day in May. And now they wanted to get that heavy crude. From where they are going to get it? They are going to rush to Saudi Arabia and others, including Canada, and tell them, I need more crude. So the demand for their own crude increased while our focus was always on global oil demand growth. So that was the mistake we had. So from their point of view, they did meet the two conditions, which is the decline in inventories and the increase in demand. So you put all of those together, there is no reason to be bearish on oil just because the group of 8 is increasing production. Now, you ask me about the future of OPEC and OPEC Plus. Even if this group disappears completely by force or by the power of law or whatever, there will always be a shadow group. There will always be a shadow group. And the reason why, because we learned the lesson long time ago that the oil market has to be managed by someone. To give you a historical example to prove this point, Rockefeller has a company called Standard Oil. Standard Oil basically controlled 90% of the market. It was a true monopoly. He was sued by the government, and like years later, the Supreme Court basically decided to break Standard Oil because it's a monopoly. Just to show you how big Standard Oil was, every single company you see today, including Chevron, ExxonMobil, etc., those are the daughters of Standard Oil. So you can see how big Standard Oil was divided into 35 companies. One of them is Exxon, one of them is Mobil, one of them is Chevron. So you can see how big it was. But why Rockefeller did this? Rockefeller did this because he realized that the cost was high, the wastage was very high, and the inefficiency was all over the industry. And if he can group it together, reduce the inefficiencies, reduce the cost, reduce the wastage, he can make a lot of money. And he did. In fact, he is one of the richest people in the history of Earth. So when they broke his empire, immediately we saw increase in wastage, increase in cost, and increase in inefficiency all over the place. Who stepped in? The government. So the government started doing exactly what he wanted. So they established the Texas Railroad Commission, or did not, it was already there, but they entrusted the Texas Railroad Commission with managing the industry. The Oklahoma Commission, in Louisiana we have a similar commission, to manage the industry, which was managed by Rockefeller before. That tells you that the industry needs to be managed, otherwise you have a total collapse and waste of resources. And when they couldn't manage it, people do not know this. When they failed to manage it, what they did, they said they sent the armed National Guard to the oil fields. They kicked out all the private companies, all the owners, etc., and the armed National Guard basically took over the fields, and they literally shut down the fields. Later on, the government basically brought in civilian guards to go sit down over the well to make sure that the well is producing less than what the operator wants. That happened in the capitalistic society of the United States. It did not happen in the Soviet Union, and it did not happen in OPEC countries. In fact, if you go back to Alfonso Perez, who is the kind of the brain behind OPEC, he will tell you, he said this in interviews, he said this in writing, that he got the idea of OPEC from the United States, from the Texas Railroad Commission. The idea of managing the market, because he saw how effective it was later on, but he forgot that they were able to do that by force by using the armed National Guard, while OPEC members cannot do it. So that's one of the reasons why OPEC failed, while the Texas Railroad Commission succeeded, because the Texas Railroad Commission had the army and had the law behind it. OPEC does not have the army and does not have the law. So they couldn't enforce it. Now, since 2016, since you asked about the future of OPEC, we've seen some kind of a new sorts of enforcement where Saudi Arabia will step in, flood the market, force Russia to come back to the fold, etc., because they realize that without enforcement, they cannot manage the market. So the conclusion of all of this is the oil market has to be managed. The management will continue, whether a smaller OPEC Plus, larger OPEC Plus, a shadow OPEC Plus, etc., government stepping in, whatever. The market will continue to be managed. And one of the reasons why OPEC Plus being successful in lowering volatility in 2024 is not only their ability to manage the market this way. We got to give a credit for the Saudi Energy Minister, Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, because he is the only one in the world who's been there for almost 40 years, doing exactly the same thing. He had photogenic memory, basically. So he had all the memory of OPEC, all the memory of the oil market. There is not a single person has the memory of the oil market like this guy. So you are talking about unbelievable experience there. Now, we are not talking about like 100% success, but relative to the other policies, it's been a great success.
How does when we think about the last couple of months, and you already mentioned President Trump a few times, I mean, he wants, at least that's what he proclaimed, he wants $50 oil. And then, of course, there was the US shale revolution, something that you have talked and written about also quite extensively, and you're more or less directly at the source as you are in Texas. How do you think will this play into the kind of management of oil/energy markets that you have described? Is, maybe as a quick add-on question, is the nature of oil changing? What I mean by this is, there is very often we distinguish in conversations about, we say, okay, there's coal, there's crude oil, there's natural gas liquids. Do you think that with technological progress, and this brings me to another topic, I'm so sorry, there's going to be so many questions folded into one, so you can take them whichever way you like, because you also mentioned a recent podcast, which I found even more fascinating related to this, when you said that the oil and gas industry was doing robotics and AI before anybody knew what robotics and AI actually were, and that there's a human resource problem in this area. So there's so much that's coming together. So from a meta perspective, if you could just try to see this as loose ends and whichever one you find the most intriguing, and you try to pull it all together, how is Trump, the human resources problem, technical innovation and the changing nature of energy, right? The switch from coal to oil, from oil to gas. How do you see in the broadest field to paint the picture with as broad and as many strokes as you desire, where the future of the industry is going?
First of all, let me explain this. First, there is a very, very limited substitution between renewable energy and oil.
Mm-hmm. So the European dream is probably not going to work out.
Correct. So some journalists and politicians keep saying, well, if we build more solar and wind, we can reduce dependence on oil imports. It's a complete nonsense. And the reason why, because solar and wind are used in power generation. And oil is rarely used in power generation in Europe, in the United States, in India, China, Japan, South Korea, etc. In fact, even in India and China, the use of oil is less than 1% of total generation. So even if they double or triple the capacity of solar and wind, it has no impact on oil demand. The impact, basically, we have out of the 104 million barrels a day that we consume on a daily basis, less than 5 million are used in power generation around the world, and most of them basically are either in oil-producing countries, very poor countries, or in islands that are very far away, that the only way to get energy to them is to use oil. Our expectation that by 2050 we can replace 2 million of them. OPEC think it's only 1 million can be replaced. So it's between 1 and 2 million that can be replaced. But again, this is for the next 25 years. So let's take this idea of renewable energy out of the picture here, because it's not going to influence it. The second one, that when it comes to electric vehicles. The people are saying that electric vehicles are going to kill the demand for oil, and demand for oil is going to decline substantially, and the oil-producing countries' economies are going to collapse. This is a nonsense on several fronts. One of them basically is because we've done all kind of research. We published this in our reports. Those who are interested, they can go and read the archives and see what's being said there. Notice that the media keep telling us about increase in sales of electric vehicles, but they will never tell you how many electric vehicles are on the road. You're not going to find it anywhere. They will always tell you sales increased by 20%, 15%, etc., but they will not tell you how many on the road. And the media, in many cases, especially the liberal media, will tell you the sales in percentages without mentioning the numbers. And you'll see headlines like, electric vehicle sales increased by 20% in this country. Well, just tell me the number, how many? So in 2023, we had a joke, basically, we always at the company, we joked about that the media, several media outlets, all of them are liberal, be reporting that Ford trucks, the sales of Ford trucks increased by 150% in the second quarter, year over year, by 150%. But they never mentioned the number. Now, Ford and other companies, when they issue their quarterly financial reports, they mention all the numbers. So why the media chose not to mention the numbers? The numbers are there. That shows you the bias. So you go back and they said the sales of this truck basically increased by 150% in the second quarter. So we're talking about 3 months, a quarter. You go back to Ford press release and you found out it's only 900 trucks. 900, but the media told us 150%. Now, is this important? Yes, because the sales of other cars are like 70,000, 40,000, but we have only 900 trucks, and the media just ignored that. So, as I mentioned that, we've done the research. So here are the conclusions. We have about 50 million electric vehicles on the road today. Okay? And more than half are in China. If you want to talk about direct replacement of gasoline and diesel, which means that assuming that those cars, if electric vehicles do not exist, then those people will buy gasoline and diesel cars. Assuming that, the replacement is less than 1.3 million barrels a day, and that's it. After spending trillions of dollars in the last 15 years, the direct replacement is only 1.3 million barrels a day. That's it. Which means that, assuming again that if electric vehicles did not exist, that oil demand today would be higher by 1.3. Of course, this assumption is not correct for various reasons. But I said direct. Why? Because we use more oil and petroleum liquids in making the electric vehicles than ICE vehicles. ICE is for internal combustion engine. Why we use more oil? Because the batteries are very heavy. Electric cars, if you have two sisters, one electric, one gasoline, the electric car is way heavier than the gasoline. This is very important for the companies because in many countries around the world, the taxation is on the weight. At the same time, if you are talking about a multi-story parking places, they are designed for a certain weight. If all the cars increases, basically you have building collapsing, you have driveways, you have garages, etc. All of these will be affected. The heavy weight, basically that means you are using more tires, you have more wear of tear and of roads as a result. So what the EV manufacturers are doing, they are trying to compensate by reducing the weight of the car. So instead of using heavy materials like steel, they want to use composite materials from petrochemicals, which uses oil and gas. So that's why electric vehicles have more oil and gas. So now we start talking about what is the net that the batteries basically are mined, and those mines in Congo and other places, or the DRC, basically you have those big vehicles that uses a lot of diesel.
Yeah.
So you subtract that, and all of a sudden, the impact on the oil market is way, way less than 1.3 million barrels a day. So there is a lot of hype on the impact of oil. You asked me before on the future of OPEC. Now think about the future of OPEC when you know that there is a lot of hype about the decrease in oil demand, but it's not. In reality, it's not. And we've seen oil demand going up despite the predictions by BP and others since 2019 that oil demand has already peaked. When BP said the oil demand has already peaked, it was 100. Now it's 104. We have an additional 4 million barrels a day above what BP has said. So these are some of the issues. We've done a study on Norway, and we found out that in Norway, supposedly, this is just theoretically speaking, if someone buys an electric vehicle instead of gasoline vehicle or diesel vehicle, then the replacement of oil demand is going to be 1-to-1, which means that if the gasoline vehicle, for example, uses 13 barrels a year of oil or gasoline, then we lost 13 barrels of gasoline. Okay, but we found out that in Norway the ratio is 10-to-6. It's not 1-to-1, which means that, and that's why gasoline demand did not decline much in Norway.
Yeah.
And we found out at least one of the reasons why, because families ended up having two cars and they split the miles or the kilometers of the year between the two cars, the gasoline car for long distances and the EV for the short distances. So the EV is not driving that much like the car, so there is no direct replacement in this case, and therefore the companies that promote EVs or the consulting firm that promote EVs are overestimating the demand, the demand for oil. And then you look at other factors that you look around right now. For example, we have a major increase in energy demand globally, and we are expecting a continuous increase in global energy demand for the following reasons. First, it's not really population growth that increases the energy demand as some people think. It's not population growth, it's urbanization. Urbanization drives the energy demand. And then you have migration. You have those Africans basically moving to Europe, or you have the Afghans moving to the United States, and you have the people from Central America moving to the United States. The increase is substantial. It's substantial to the extent that moving the tens of thousands of Afghan families to the United States after the US withdrew from Afghanistan, the moment they landed in the United States and they lived in apartments and houses, the demand for energy increased by 70-fold. 70-fold. So you have that reason. And then people forget about a very important issue. As incomes increase in economies like China, India, and others, we call them the emerging economies, and of course even in poorer countries. When people income, for example, I'm just making this up, double, they are not going to eat double. When people's income doubles, they are not going to double the amount of clothing they wear. But the first thing they will do is to spend it on comfort. And comfort for most of those people is to install air conditioning at the house, in the office. And air conditioners are massive consumers of energy. And that's why we mentioned earlier that the domestic demand in OPEC Plus increases in the summer. That's one of the reasons. So that's another reason. And then you have AI. You have autonomous vehicles. You add all of those together, what is the impact here? When governments adopted climate change policies, the purpose was to replace coal and natural gas. They wanted wind and solar to replace coal and natural gas, and in some places to replace oil. Now that's impossible to happen. Because the growth in renewables in terms of generation is barely keeping up with the demand increase for energy.
That's,
and
I think,
therefore,
That's the point they always hide. It's like what you said with the electric vehicles, right? They say, look at the numbers, like wind and solar is growing so fast, but they never show you how fast demand is also growing.
Correct. So what we are going to end up with a situation where the demand for oil, gas, and coal is way higher than any other forecast. And so these are some of the issues. Now we come to shale, to answer your question directly now. The Trump administration, or Trump himself, promised us that he will increase U.S. production substantially. We've done a report on this for those who are interested. Basically, we said it's impossible, even if oil prices go to $90, it's impossible to increase U.S. oil production by significantly, and we outlined those reasons. We will see an increase with higher prices, but not significant increase, because we reach a limit where there are several issues has to be concerned, and I'm going to mention them quickly. First of all, the growth in the shale industry. Now we are producing, by the way, 9 million barrels a day out of shale. That growth happened with cheap money, when interest rate was zero, when interest rate was 1% and 2%. Now interest rate is multiples of that. It happened when funds and others basically were rushing to finance shale. After 2016, we've seen many organizations basically, because of climate change policies, deciding not to invest in oil and gas anymore, so the money is not there, even if interest rate is low. The second change, which is an important change, that the shale industry was brought to the market and grew with smaller companies and medium-sized companies. The oil majors have nothing to do with it. The model basically was drill, baby, drill, which means that I have a company of 10 people and we have some properties. Our objective basically is to drill, prove reserves, increase production, regardless of cash flow, and then sell the company for multiples for to a bigger company. So my objective is to increase reserves and increase production. And to do so, I need to drill. But thousands of people have been doing the same thing. This is not the case anymore. Now the industry is controlled by Chevron and ExxonMobil. So that changed. So drill, baby, drill is not going to happen. Chevron and Exxon, just Rockefeller and OPEC, are after control. And the third change is because of this massive growth in production. And now we are at record high in March, 13.4 million barrels a day for the US, and over 9 million for shale. The issue here is, as everyone knows, decline rates in shale wells are very high relative to regular traditional wells. The decline in traditional well is 3 to 6%. The decline in shale wells is 40% and higher. So when I grow to 9, the amount of oil I need to replace to keep production flat every month or every year is extremely high, which means that most of the investment is going to go just to maintain production. And as I go higher, the amount is going to get higher and higher. And therefore, these are some of the reasons we highlighted in our reports that why Trump cannot get what he wanted out of this. So that's why we go back to the beginning of the show today, that when I said that US exports, Brazil exports, if you add all of those, US, Brazil, Venezuela, and Ecuador, their exports declined by about 1 million barrels a day. Basically, that's just kind of part of the story, and why the group of 8 are increasing production while prices are going up. This is part of the story. So when it comes to the US, we have another problem. Shale produces light sweet crude. Venezuela produces heavy crude. Canada produces heavy crude. So there is no substitution here. They complement each other. So people always forget about crude quality. Crude quality is extremely important in this case. So if we end up with this massive growth in electric vehicles and the demand for gasoline declines substantially, which I get from light sweet crude, then I don't need shale anymore. I don't need the growth. So this is one of the reasons why Trump is after electric vehicles, because he realizes that this is going to kill the US dominance when it comes to energy supplies and crude. Okay, so we got to pay attention to crude quality the same way we pay attention to crude quantity.
So not all oils are made equal.
Correct.
Do you think, is there also a refining issue? I assume that many of the US refineries are not made for.
It's a two-step thing to look at. First of all, any additions in shale is going to be exported because we did reach a refining wall in the United States for light sweet crude. But this is not the issue. The issue is demand. Okay? If you look forward, most of the demand is for the heavier products, not for the lighter products. So the issue is demand, is not refining. We can switch refining back, there is no problem. But if there is no demand, why pay billions of dollars to switch?
So what is, when you say, when demand is higher for the heavy crudes, maybe just for the complete layperson like myself, what are some of the products that you get out of heavy crude compared to light crude? Is it
For
light
example,
crude?
diesel.
Yeah.
Diesel. The amount of diesel I get from the medium sour and the heavy sour is way larger than the light crude.
Aha.
And trucking, the growth in trucking basically, especially in Asia, is going to be massive. So that's one of the reasons. If you look at trucking in the United States, basically it is the backbone of the economy. Trucking basically in the United States is more important than energy. Okay, so you need diesel. And if you look at, for example, the shipping industry, you need fuel oil, which is the backbone of the global economy. And fuel oil basically comes from heavy crude. It does not come from the light crude.
So my last question then is, and you touched upon this in another interview, and I think it's a nice way to conclude our conversation. Can you talk a little bit about the human resources issue in the oil and gas industry?
Yes, we've been having serious problems for recent years in human resources. And what happened is you have people who are very smart people who went into petroleum engineering, geology, and geophysics and all that stuff, all those fields, only to find out that they work for a company for 15 years and then you have lower oil prices, and because of the cyclicality in the industry, they get laid off and they cannot find a job. And now they have to wait for the second increase until they go back to the job or try to switch majors, etc. This be repeated several times, so people shied away from the field completely and they are not returning to the industry. At the same time, we have all the climate change rhetoric that affected the education of kids, even in elementary school, and the attitude of kids toward the oil industry. So if you look at Generation Z right now, no one wants to work for the oil industry because they think it's a dirty, bad industry. They don't want to be in it. So the industry realized a long time ago that they have a serious problem with human resources. At the same time, oil is found in some places in a very remote areas, either in Alaska, where temperature is 50 below, or in the desert when the temperature is 50 plus, or in the middle of the ocean where you can come to shore only once a month or every couple of weeks. It's just kind of a very remote places where you have to pay people a lot of money to accept such jobs. So the industry was at the forefront of mechanization, robotics, AI, etc., long before even people heard about it, simply to reduce the cost on one side and avoid the shortages they experience. So in addition, because these are remote areas and subject to weather, you look at the Gulf of Mexico, you have all those hurricanes, etc. You look at Norway, where you have all those storms from time to time, and you cannot work in the winter in some areas. You look at Siberia, for example. So it makes more sense to go robotics than to hire people, given these things, these changes that take place. And it's way easier, because one of the problems you end up with is if there is a hurricane coming to the Gulf of Mexico, the first thing you want to do is send a helicopter to pick up everyone from the platform, bring them back, and wait until the storm passes and then take them back, etc. So your human resources become kind of your main concern, because you might lose the platform, this is all right, but if you lose one life, it's a disaster. So you lose a robot. It's fine. It's all right.
I mean, there would be so much more to get to. Maybe as a very, very quick final question that just came to mind when you mentioned Sabir, and just to give you a very quick statement. I remember when the war in Ukraine broke out after the Russian invasion, there were some analysts like Peter Saihan and others who said, well, without Western support, without Western technology, the Russian oil industry, the Russian gas industry will collapse within 12 months. I think what we have seen now that the Russian oil and gas industry did not collapse. Can you maybe just, do you have any thoughts on this? And if yes, it would be wonderful if you could share them.
If people go back to my Twitter account and the articles I wrote at that time, I was one of the very few people who opposed all those views. We have people saying that the production will decline by 3 to 5 million barrels a day, and our view was the maximum, if everything goes wrong, it will be 600. And the final decline was 250. So we were more accurate on this than anyone else. And people forget that the modern oil industry started in Russia, not in the United States. It started in Baku. And when Russia was controlling Azerbaijan. Okay? And Stalin, basically, the whole revolution that took place in Russia, Stalin came into the area and literally, because there were most of the oil wells were run by young men, no women, no families. So he was able to rally them, and without them, we would not have seen communism. So Russia basically had the head start, not only on drilling for oil. Basically, they had the first pipeline, they have the first rail, they have the first ship, they have the first of so many things. So to ignore all of that and say, well, they are not going, it's Western technology is a complete nonsense. So that's number one. Number two, we had the Western service companies, okay? They are still there until today. People forget that most of the companies that said they were leaving Russia, if you go back, you find out that they are still there. They did not leave. And that's a big issue. In fact, the only company, service company that left, without mentioning names, do you know what they did a trick? They sold their company to their employees. Now hold on just a second. Russian employees are able to buy a branch of a US company? I mean, whom you are kidding here? So the companies are still there. The services are still there. And whatever they want, they can get from China, whether it's Chinese technology or China importing it for them. So they were able to do all of that. Anyway, you put all of those together, it explains to you what happened.
Very interesting. So again, so much more to get to. I hope that we can have you back on in the future. Dr. Anas, thank you very much for your time. This was an enlightening conversation. I think we touched so many issues. I kept you much longer than I intended. For that, I apologize, but I think it was absolutely worth it.
No problem
at all.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Thanks.